So there's a chat function for all panelists if you want to discuss among ourselves. Hi, everyone. I think we have enough people to start. Welcome to the Vietnam Finance Society webinar on Vietnamese law and Korean investment. My name is Nam Phan, and I will be the moderator for this program today. In the audiences today, we have about 40 people joined so far. So we have finance and consulting professionals and business people, as well as lawyers and students from the US, Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam. I think this is probably the most diverse group of attendees that we have in our VFS webinar series, so thank you a lot for joining. Again, please note that this webinar is for informational purpose only, and there will be no legal advice given, but you are welcome to submit your question using the Zoom Q&A feature below, and our speakers will answer them if time permits. So our webinar today will highlight some of the changes in the Vietnamese new investment law, the new Decree 35, implementing the competition law on pre-merger filing, and a draft decree on securities law that will directly relate to foreign investment in Vietnam. We will then, after that, we'll go over some of the trends in Korean investment into Vietnam. As you know, Vietnam is currently one of the hottest investment spots in Asia. We have consistent GDP growth over 6% over the years, a sizable market, and a very young and dynamic labor force. So all of these factors actually contributed to Vietnam's success in attracting international investment, especially away from China. For example, if we take a look at the Korean FDI over the year, like 10 years ago in 2010, the Korean FDI was like 850 million, and now it's already 7.9 billion last year. Also, Vietnam recently has been in international spotlight for being able to successfully control the coronavirus pandemic. So given all of these international recognition and business interest, the Vietnamese government this year has passed a series of new business laws, including the new investment law, the Decree 35 on competition, which we will go over in a few minutes. All of these new laws, together with the securities law passed last year, are expected to have major impacts on the environment, the investment environment in Vietnam, particularly in M&A. So before I introduce our speakers today, please allow me to reintroduce myself and Vietnam Finance Society for the attendees who have just joined. My name is Nam Phan. I grew up in Vietnam, and currently I'm working at a New York law firm called Milbank. We're formerly known as Milbank Tweed McCloy, and some of you might have heard of our firm through some of the deals such as our IPO of Vietjet in 2017, and the purchase of 100 aircraft, Boeing aircrafts, for also for Vietjet. Hi, Darren. About Vietnam Finance Society, or VFS, our host for the webinar today. VFS is a nonprofit organization headquartered in New York. Our members include finance and business professionals in the US, Singapore, Vietnam. In addition to this type of webinar, we also hold other regular events, and we have a summer fellowship program to provide networking as well as mentorship opportunities for our young Vietnamese professionals. So I would like next to introduce our speakers today. We're very honored to have Mr. Thang Pham, who's a counsel at YKVN law firm in the Singapore office. He has more than 12 years of experience in corporate M&A, capital market, banking, and finance. Mr. Pham graduated from Hanoi University of Law. He earned his LLM degree from UC Berkeley and is one of the very few Vietnamese lawyers qualified to practice in California. The second speaker is Mr. Ujin Ahn. He's a senior attorney at Korean law firm Bae Kim & Lee. Mr. Ahn is currently based in Ho Chi Minh City. He has over 10 years of experiences in Vietnam and was also one of the first Korean lawyers who pioneered the Vietnamese market. Mr. Ahn graduated from Korea University and earned his Juris Doctor degree at Duke. He's also one of the few lawyers who are dual qualified in New York and Massachusetts. So now, having introduced our speakers, I will turn the virtual podium to Mr. Thang Pham from YKVN to discuss some of the recent changes in Vietnamese law. Mr. Pham, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Nam, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be on this webinar today. So as Nam introduced, first of all, I'm just going to cover the major changes in the recent investment law that has just been adopted by the National Assembly of Vietnam this last month. So let me just share my screen. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. So first of all, I would like just to give you guys some background on the changes in the Vietnamese investment law in the last 30 years since Vietnam opened up its economy in 1986. Vietnam has issued or amended its investment law for 8 times. During those 8 times, we see two biggest changes, two biggest time where the investment law have a very significant impact on the amount of FDI in Vietnam, which is in 2005. You see here there's a lot of investment in 2005, and right after that you see a big spike in the amount of FDI attraction in Vietnam. And this is also the year Vietnam entered into the WTO, right? So the second time when you see a big change in the Vietnamese FDI regulation is in 2014, where Vietnam issued the new law, and you see that the FDI amount has been steadily picking up since then. Now, last year, Vietnam entered into 2 major FTA, the one which is the CCTPP, and the second one is the Vietnam-EU FTA, which are expected to have a significant change or impact on the Vietnamese economy. So one of the reasons why Vietnam now issue a series of new laws and regulations relating to business in 2020, part of that is to implement those new commitment by Vietnam in those new generation FTA. So that's why we see the 2020 law and investment. So that's the background for the changes that we are talking about today, right? The changes in the new law are provided for 3 big goals. Number one, as stated in the government's report on the law, it is fixing a lot of overlaps and inconsistencies with other law. And as we can see here, most of those overlapping and inconsistencies are with the law relating to real estate and land. And as the government pushed forward for administrative procedural reform, the new investment law also cut short a lot of procedures relating to investment to trying to make it more efficient and easier for investors in general. The second big theme is reducing transfer pricing, tax evasion, use of outdated technology, and natural resource intensive projects. Contraband investment and adding a new national security requirement for assessing foreign investment. This is one of the mandate from the Politburo of Vietnam. This is consistent with the general theme of Vietnam of moving from a labor-intensive economy, resource-intensive projects into high technology, high value-added economy, right? So with that, the law also aimed to promote new investment in innovative and technology-intensive projects, and promoting sharing economy and new form of companies and new form of investment project. So there are many, technical and small changes in the law. So listed here are the key changes that I think would be interesting for foreign investors. So we're talking about changes relating to what kind of investment capital can you use to make investment in Vietnam, from cash to assets to IP to contract right. That's the first change. The second change is one of those new provisions in the law added to encourage more startup project. The third one is a requirement on national security. For the first time, it is introduced in the law as a focus for the review of foreign investment. During the time we have today, maybe I'll just focus on the first three changes. The remaining changes here will have some impact on foreign investment, but it is to a more technical level. So maybe we will talk about that in another occasion. So talking about investment capital, currently investors by law have the right to use own kind of asset to make their investment in Vietnam. That include cash, movable property, real property, IP, goodwill, trademarks. But as a matter of practice, the old laws seem to encourage only cash investment. So just to make it very clear, and just to show it is the policy of the government to encourage a more diverse form of capital to be used as investment, the new law make it very clear that you can use all kind of assets provided in the law of Vietnam, as well as in the international treaties that Vietnam is a member, as investment capital in Vietnam. So we are talking about the new CPTPP and the EU-Vietnam FTP. They both have a very broad definition of investment capital. Probably one of the goal of this new change, even though it is a small drafting change, but it is show that Vietnam is ready to take advantage of the transition or the relocation of investment project from other country or China into Vietnam. So investors, instead of having to liquidate all of their plan and asset in other country, they can just simply take over the asset and move it to Vietnam, or use those as their investment in Vietnam, right? So the question is, can the investor themselves indicate the value to those assets that they use? Yes, they can. When they make investment and they prepare for to get approval for making the investment, they can set out the value that they deem appropriate for their assets they are used to invest. But there's a catch, right? So there's a new provision that says, yes, you can do that, but we can audit. So the tax authority and the investment authority have the right to audit your valuation, and they can hire independent evaluator to do that. And if, as a result of such valuation, your tax liabilities go up, then you have to pay, and you bear the cost for the audit. So this is supposed to limit transfer pricing and to trying to have a control over how those assets will be used as investment. So that's the change on investment capital. So next, I'm going to talk about one of the new changes in relating to startup projects. This is quite exciting. This is the first time the law and investment, make it very clearly that startup projects are encouraged and are protected by one of the investment protections provided by the law and investment. So there's a clear definition of startup project, which is a project based on the use of IP technology, new investment model, and having a potential of rapid growth. We will need to see how this definition will be implemented in a decree of the government. But looking at this definition, it is clear that a lot of new business will be entitled to, will be eligible to claim some of the protection and encouragement under the new law. So what are those? Number one, startup project, incubators, sharing workspace, project in technical infrastructure and distribution channel are entitled to investment incentives. They are entitled to a more preferential CIT tax rate. They're entitled to more a lower import or export tax rate. They're entitled to a better accounting regime. So those are the incentives that those startup projects can claim and can apply. And more interestingly, I think this is the first time foreign investors, when they invest in Vietnam, setting up new startup company or investing into startup investment funds, they don't even need to get an investment certificate, registration certificate. So this is new. This is very encouraging for foreign investor if they are looking to take advantage of those policy, and especially if you are in tech and technology and you want to take advantage of the IT workforce in Vietnam. I think this is something that you should look out for. Now, the law also recognized new form of investment. So this is just some kind of general provisions that's setting out, okay, what kind of form of investment can you make? You can set up new companies, you can buy shares, you can, implementing new investment project. You make investment in form of contract like business cooperation contract, BCC, or PPP. Now there is a new item here, is just saying you can make other form of new investment that right now the law doesn't contemplate yet, but it will, allow the government to specify what are those new form of investment. For example, sharing economy, Uber, Grab, or P2P lending. So, we should all be look out for new detailed regulation from the government on what kind of investment we can make, right? And lastly, I'm going to talk about the new national security requirement. in US, you know that there is a commission, the CFIUS. Vietnam recently, the Politburo have requested that there must be some kind of requirement on national defense and security. Now, this is not something that is not in Vietnamese law before. You know, under the old law, there are bases for rejecting foreign investment or terminating investment project if those investment projects can adversely affect the national defense or security of Vietnam. But now the new law have added a mechanism that you know, some project will be subject to more review and before those investment can be implemented. So this is a list of all of the places in the new law where the new law implement the national security, and most notably is Article 32.1, requiring that if you are buying shares in a company or a project located in an area affecting national security, you must be approved by the People's Committee. So this will be based on the land use rights certificate. So in Vietnam, the right to use land is certified in a piece of paper called the Red Book, the Land Use Rights Certificate. So if you are investing into a project or a company in a sensitive location, you will be subject to this kind of review. Now, the law provides that those sensitive locations right now are island, you know, borderline area, coastal area, and other area that can affect national security. So we don't know what other areas are, right? So, so the test here is still unclear, and it is still, you know, subject to how the government will implement this regulation, and to know for sure that whether or not, you know, a foreign investor will need to look out for this kind of requirement. So we expect to see that. Otherwise, you know, we expect to see the government will delegate the local authority or delegate to some ministry to have some kind of guidance on this broad or new category of review. Now, with this change in the policy, what does it mean for the nominee structure? Let's say if you are a foreigner and you want to buy land in Vietnam and you are not allowed to own land in Vietnam, and you appoint someone else to do that for you. So it has been a practice in Vietnam, and court are split on whether or not this practice is acceptable. Now, with this new change in the policy, you know, to limit sham investment and to limit, you know, fake transaction, well, does it mean, you know, will be a new in the approach on nominee structure? I think there will. I think we need to look out for this regulation, and especially the degree of the government, and we gotta, you know, pay close attention to all of the change relating to the nominee structure and this kind of arrangement. So those are the very big overview of the first changes, 3 changes in the new law. Here that you see, there are other changes that are aimed to facilitate investment, you know, simplify procedure, and also there are, you know, change that reflect how the government's policy in terms of encouraging certain sectors and discourage some other sector. For example, here you see that debt collection business is no longer permitted. So for this change, you will see that banks and, you know, consumer financing company will need to find a new way of doing their business from now until 2021, when the new law comes into effect. So So yes, that's the overview of the new change in the investment law. Now back to you. Do you have any question?
I think nobody has asked any question from the audience yet, so I'll just ask a few questions that I have prepared.
Okay.
So first, could you tell us a very basic thing, like what kind of foreign investor has to obtain written approval from the Vietnamese government before they join? For example, I heard that if you acquire more than 50%, 51% of share of a Vietnamese-based company, or if you're engaging in a conditional line of business, then you have to get government approval.
Yeah, so foreign investors will basically need to get two kind of approval. Number one is the investment registration certificate. So every foreign investor, when they make an investment into Vietnam, either setting up a new company, setting up a new project, they will need to get this registration certificate. Number two, if you invest in Vietnam, but if you don't set up a new company, you don't need to get this investment certificate, but you will need to get the approval for the acquisition of shares or capital contribution in existing companies in Vietnam, right? So that's where you see those criteria or condition for when an investor will need to get the M&A. It's called the M&A approval, right? So if you buy shares in a company that make the foreign ownership in that company crossing the threshold of 50%, then you will need to get the M&A approval. That's the first condition. The second condition is if you're buying into a company and the company is operating in a conditional business, then you will need to get the M&A approval. Now, the third condition is that I just mentioned before about the national security. If you're buying into a company and that company is located in a sensitive location, then the foreign investor will also need to get the M&A approval. So the bottom line is, if you are a foreign investor, you're setting up a new company in Vietnam, you will need to get a registration certificate for your investment. And in order to do that, there's a procedure to obtain the investment registration certificate. You may need to get in principle approval from different level of authority, depending on how on the nature of your investment, on the size of your investment. You may need to get the in principle approval from coming up from the National Assembly, the Prime Minister, down to the People's Committee, depending on what your project is. So that's the registration certificate. And the second type is M&A approval. I just mentioned is applicable to acquisition of shares, and you will need to get the M&A approval for certain type of investment. If you're buying shares in companies in a conditional business, if you're buying significant amount of shares that makes the foreign ownership in the company crossing the 50% threshold, or if you're buying into a company in a sensitive location. So I mentioned about conditional business. In the law, there is a list of those conditional business. Those are the business that the government deemed to have an effect on, public security, national defense, public policy, general health. So for those considerations, the government decided, yes, we will allow you to do this, but you will need to comply with certain conditions, and you will need to comply with more licensing requirement in order for you to be controlled and be administered better by the government.
Thank you for your answer. I think the national security theme is an important change in the investment law this year. We have another very interesting question from the audience. Maybe Mr. Pham, we can take that question and then we can move on to the next topic. So I'll read the question for everybody. This is from Thang Pham. Could you talk more in details about contraband investment or đầu tư núp bóng. Please give some typical examples of this type of contraband investment structure.
Sure. This is started out from, you know, the fact that some of the foreign investors, when they want to acquire land in Vietnam, they use provisions under the law on land that allow companies or landowners to use land to contribute into companies. So foreign investors, instead of having to acquire the land, they can just acquire the company. So they can in effect have the control of the land by controlling the company. So this is permitted under Vietnamese law. But in the recent year, there are foreign investors using this approach to have control of some pieces of land that the government deemed to be in very key strategic sensitive location. So because of that, now we see a new focus on having the local authority have a better review and administer those kind of investment. We still need to see how the government will actually implement that new requirement, and we still need to see if those requirements will in effect make the structure will be more difficult to be implemented in practice.
Thank you. I think we can move on to the next topic.
Okay. The second topic is pre-merger filing. I think this is relevant to parties in an M&A transaction, and in particular an economic concentration. So the new competition of Vietnam was issued in 2018 with a new decree 35 just came into effect very recently. There's a new requirement that you have to report your M&A, your acquisition to the National Competition Commission, the NCC of Vietnam, before you can, and get the clearance before you can go ahead with your acquisition. So this is the overview of the process. So basically, if you see that you are one of the reportable transaction, you have to do it. You have to go and do it and get the clearance before you go ahead. The problem with this is the reportable criteria for M&A transaction is defined very broadly, and it is clearly a very new decree, and there are a lot of there are not so many precedent and not so many cases that we can use to determine whether a particular M&A transaction is or is not reportable to the authority. So that's why this is something I think will be relevant, will need to be followed closely by foreign investor. So what kind of transaction are we talking about? We're talking about merger, we're talking about consolidation of companies, acquisition of shares or assets, and joint venture. So every time if you entered into one of these form of transaction, you need to check whether or not your transaction is one of the transaction that must be reported to the authority to get the clearance. There's in the decree 35, there is a clear definition of what kind of acquisition will be reportable, and that is subject to the concept of control. So if you're acquiring shares or assets in a company so that you can control the company, you can control the business of the company, or you can control 50% of the asset of that company, then it's likely that your transaction will need to be reported to the NCC. Now, this is interesting, a very new requirement in the competition law, which is the law now not only apply to onshore M&A transaction, but it also apply to offshore economic concentration. What does that mean? So if, let's say, if two global companies with, let's say, 75% of the global market share, and the two of them merge together, and each of the company has a small branch office in Vietnam or a small rep office in Vietnam. So the transaction is in the US or outside of Vietnam. But now we have the answer. You need to go and check to get the clearance in Vietnam if your transaction has or may have anti-competitive effect on the Vietnamese market. So this change was subject to much debate when it was introduced to the national security. There are comments that say, how can you implement this law? Vietnamese law traditionally only apply within the territory of Vietnam. So how can we implement some kind of control over transactions that are outside of Vietnam, right? So, but the view supporting this requirement is saying that the NCC will need to rely on international commitment, international organization, and the treaties that Vietnam have in place in order to get the this requirement being implemented in place. So these are very, to me, this is a very rare occasion where Vietnam reached out of the Vietnamese law, reached out of the territory of Vietnam. So I just want to mention that the other occasion is where Vietnamese tax authority in 2014 or 15, they trying to impose tax on offshore M&A transaction if the main assets being transferred in that M&A transaction, offshore M&A transaction, is an asset in Vietnam. So Vietnamese tax authority also want to try to get the tax out of that transaction as well. So those are the two occasions where we see Vietnam is trying to reach out of the territory of Vietnam. So we are talking about the kind of transaction that may need to be reported. So next is the reportable threshold. So if you are one of that transaction, and if you meet the criteria, the 4 criteria on this slide, then you will need to go and report. So those criteria are, number 1 is the market share, the combined market share of the two parties or those parties in concentration. If you reach 20%, then that transaction is reportable. The second one is the transaction side. Let's say if the purchase price of the share acquisition reach more than $43 million, then you will need to get the report as well. This transaction size threshold is even higher for companies in the financial sector, for example, insurance or securities company, banks and credit institutions even have a more higher threshold. One thing to note on this transaction size threshold, when a parties entered into a transaction, they have an agreed purchase price, an agreed value that for the transaction, right? The question is whether or not the Vietnamese authority will look at that agreed value, or do they will, by themselves calculate the fair market value of the transaction? We don't know yet. That is something, will need to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. If the value of transaction is close enough, maybe the authority will use your value. But if it is, too small compared to what the authority perceives of your real fair market value of your company, then maybe they will question that, or maybe they will use their own calculation. The third criteria is asset value. This criteria look at the total assets of one of the party, not all of the party, just one of the party. So if one of the party to the merger is big enough, that has the asset of more than 130 million, then whatever transaction they enter into will need to be reported to the government, right? Same for the transaction side, you have a higher threshold for financial related companies like insurance, securities company, banks, and credit institution. Supposedly, this company will have a higher asset in their business, so they are subject to a higher threshold. The third, the final criteria is revenue. Same as the asset value, you look at the revenue of either one of the party to the concentration, and if that value reach the certain threshold, then the transaction will need to be reported. So once you report your transaction, then the transaction will be subject to what they call a prelim review. And the National Commission, Competition Commission will either allow you to go ahead, or they will ask you to submit more documents for an official appraisal. So in what circumstances when they will allow you to go ahead? The first situation is where your combined market share is less than 20%. Let's say your assets is very high, the transaction size is really big, your revenue is really big, but the combined market share of the two of those parties in the transaction is smaller than 20%. Then more likely that you can go ahead with the transaction after you submit the prelim filing. The second permissible situation is where your market concentration is low. Let's say even if you have a high market share, but let's say there are many players in the market, and each player has a small number of market share, then they say the market concentration is low enough, then you can go ahead with the transaction. So this is the first time Vietnam finally adopted the HHI. This is the formula used by many countries to calculate the market concentration level in a market. So this is just basically saying that there are many players in the market, and the acquisition may not affect the level of competitiveness in the economy, so you can go ahead with the transaction. The final permissible case is vertical merger. So it's where, for example, both of the parties to the transaction operate in the same manufacturing chain or distribution chain as a buyer or seller for the same product, then you will be permitted to go ahead. So I think the argument here is because they are both in the same product anyway, so there's no change in the market share for that product. There will be no change in the general competition in Vietnam, so therefore they can go ahead with the acquisition. So those are the three cases where you can go ahead. Now, in terms of procedure, after you file, you need to wait for 30 days to get the either a clearance, a written notice from the authorities that say, yes, you're clear, you can go ahead. Or after 30 days, if you don't receive any clearance, you can still go ahead, because the law clearly specifies that, yes, you have to wait for 30 days, but if the NCC doesn't reply in 30 days, then you can go ahead. Now, in practice, I think in practice, the NCC will either reply, or in one of the cases that we are handling right now, they will ask for more information. They will ask for more clarification. So if they don't like your transaction, we will know right away. You don't have to wait until the end of the 30-day period. Now, if at the end of that prelim appraisal process, you are not cleared, you cannot go ahead, then after that, the NCC will go into what they call the official appraisal process. That's where they look closely into your transaction, and they will evaluate different criteria, the anti-competitiveness effect of the transaction, the positive impact of the transaction. For example, even though the transaction will make the market share of the parties go up, but then it is good for the Vietnam economy in general, or it's good for the competitiveness of Vietnamese companies, or it's good for the economy of scale, technology advances, all of that good stuff, then the NCC will consider and balance those two criteria and see whether they will give you the green light to go ahead. Now, these are unquantifiable factors, and there are no clear cut, and a lot of these are will be subject to how the NCC, whether they are familiar with your industry, whether they are familiar with the nature of your business, and a lot of these will involve how you present your transaction and how you persuade the authority that your transaction is actually permissible. And this is where the companies and the lawyers involved will need to play a big role in helping the NCC understand and have a better view of the nature of transaction. So that is the overview of the pre-merger filings. Nam, do you have any questions?
I thank you, Mr. Pham. So this M&A is my practice, so I have like a list of 20 questions, but I'm not gonna ask because it's gonna take all the time. I think this is the pre-merger filing is very similar to HSR filing in the US, so that will have very big impact in the way parties negotiate, for example, closing conditions or all of the closing date in their M&A deal. I think we can switch to Mr. Ahn Ujin to talk about Korean investment in Vietnam, since we're kind of running out of time. Mr. Pham, are you okay with it?
Yes.
Okay. Could you stop sharing so Mr. Ahn Ujin can share his slides?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Ujin Ahn. I'm a Korean by nationality, an American lawyer by profession, and a Vietnam resident in terms of my residence. It's been 10 years since I've been working in Vietnam with a short stint in Thailand and Myanmar in between. Today I'm going to discuss with you the trends of Korean investments in Vietnam. And you might wonder why Korea and not other countries. Well, I'll explain why, how the Korean investors have played out so far in Vietnam and how they will play out in the future. Of course, now we're in a difficult time of COVID situation. I think it's not an exception for Korean investors as well. This time, most of the investors are kind of in a wait and watch approach rather than making active investments as usual. So please allow me to start going over the slides I have prepared. Thang, did you close out your slide?
Yes.
Okay, let me open up my slide. Okay, all of you can see my slides now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of when the Vietnam opened up its market in 1988 with the adoption of đôi mối policy. I have the data collected from 1988 until last year, until the end of last year, 2019. And when you see from these slides, Korea is the leading foreign investor in Vietnam with 67.7 billion US dollars of investments far, followed by Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Japan is pretty close to following up with Korea. When you see the data from Singapore and Hong Kong, you need to be careful because these may not be investors from Singapore or Hong Kong, but they may include numbers from other countries investing through Singapore and Hong Kong via special purpose vehicles. So the top two countries, if you count and see from this chart, is Korea and Japan, making the two largest investments into Vietnam from 1988 until last year. Let's look at the breakdown by industry of investments. Not a surprise, but manufacturing industry account for 60% of total investment in Vietnam, followed by real estate, power, gas, and utilities, and etc. So traditionally, Vietnam has been very strong in encouraging manufacturing businesses to be invested into Vietnam. And Korean investors mostly also started out their investment with manufacturing business in Vietnam. On your right, you will see a chart by geographical breakdown. I have extracted 6 different locations of popular investment destination in Vietnam. Those are from left, Ho Chi Minh City, Bình Dương, Hanoi, Dong Nai, Vũng Tàu, and Bắc Ninh. Okay, all these 6 locations add up to around 55% of total investments in Vietnam. So the other remaining 45% spread out other than these 6 locations, such as Hải Phòng, Da Nang, Cần Thơ, and other provinces. If you see from this chart, I want to divide between the investment to the north and south. If you see Ho Chi Minh City, Bình Dương, Dong Nai, Vũng Tàu, all these 4 locations in the charts, they add up to 40% of total 55% in the chart, meaning 40% from south and 15% from Hanoi and Bắc Ninh area. So here is the data from 2017 to 2019. Korea, Japan, Singapore, China, Hong Kong, top 5 countries. From 2017 to 2018, you can see Japan has made slightly more investments than Korea in those 2 years. And 2019, last year, Korea jumped back up to be the leading investor in Vietnam. And if you see all from this data, Korean investment to Vietnam accounts for approximately more than 20% of total investment in Vietnam by all countries. So that's not a small figure. I think it has significant meaning in why and how Korea has made significant investment in Vietnam thus far. If you see the numbers, Korea has made 8.5 billion in 2017, 7.2 billion in 2018, and jumped back to 7.9 billion in 2019, making the leading country in terms of investment in Vietnam. Also, you look at the number of the projects, steadily increasing from 861 projects in 2017 to more than 1,100 projects in 19. So if you see the investment last year, Korean investment in Vietnam increased by 10%, around 10% compared to the previous year, in an amount to almost $8 billion US. Let's look at some more data here. If you see the investment by region, you see more investment being made from 2017 and 2019 in the northern area rather than the southern area. And you may ask why I told you that more investments were being made in the southern area, but then 2017 and 2019 there are more investment coming into northern area. Well, over the past several years, I understand the Vietnam government has been encouraging foreign investors to invest more into the northern area to close the gap of development and disparity of development between the northern and southern area. They persuade and convince foreign investors, emphasizing there is more growth potential in northern area. There's more availability of labor workers in northern area, and the land fee is comparably more attractive in northern area than the southern area, in addition to incentives provided by the provincial authorities nearby the northern major cities such as Hanoi and Haiphong. So if you want to distinguish the Korean investments into two different regions, northern and southern. First, northern is big players market, meaning Hanoi, Bangin, Hajang, and Ninh provinces. I mean, there are some big giant companies from Korea investing in the northern areas, such as Samsung and LG. This is significant because when Samsung, LG comes into the market, they're not coming in alone. They bring in hundreds of vendors and suppliers with them to the market. So it has significant impact of supply chains being moved into these areas rather than the Samsung and LG themselves. Recently, Hyundai Motors also advanced into the Ninh to operate an assembly automobile manufacturing plant in a form of joint venture with a Vietnam company. So that's basically the status of northern market. Southern market has been traditionally strong, an older history of Korean investors entering into this market. Industries such as textiles, garments, shoes making, sewing companies, and extending over the spectrum of electronics, constructions, pharmaceuticals, and chemical plants markets. So there are all kinds of diverse Korean investors advancing into southern market with longer history than the more northern history. Not to name solar energy projects in central and southern parts because of abundance of sunlight, obviously, for solar power projects. And Ho Chi Minh City has a reputation of testing platform for investment in Vietnam So this means that they open up a rep office, branches, or testing company in Ho Chi Minh City to go through the trial period before making huge investments elsewhere in Vietnam. So initially, Korean investments in Vietnam was focused on light industries such as textiles and clothing. Nowadays, because of COVID situation, I hear growing concerns from them. They're being seriously impacted by the situation, and hopefully things will clear up and resume their business as normal. This all changed in 2009 when Samsung established huge production base in northern province of Quang Ninh. It means that they invested huge amounts for manufacture of their mobile phones in northern province of Quang Ninh. Samsung has two big plants, one north for manufacture of mobile phones, and in the south they have another one for home appliances manufacturer. And because of Samsung Electronics advancing to Quang Ninh, Samsung Display and LG Haiphong also followed the footsteps of Samsung Electronics to their footprint in northern area. And Hyosung recently also expanded their business into a chemical plant in Vũng Tàu. So all this attractive growth potential in Vietnam with stable economic growth of 6 to 7% annually made Vietnam a very attractive destination for Korean investors to continue and expand their business operations in Vietnam. I've gone through the slides by the breakdown of industries, but that breakdown also applies to Korean investors as well. Korean investors largely invest majority of their businesses in manufacturing businesses, followed by real estate. And you can notice here that investment in distribution sector has been increased significantly as compared to 2017 and 2018 last year. So if you see from the previous slide, more investment coming into distribution industry, and this is also particularly interesting in that Korean investors are not only focusing in manufacturing the products and exporting those products to the buying countries in Europe and the US, but they're also eyeing the Vietnam local market. And that's why they're interested in expanding their business to distribute. And also amendments to the Vietnam regulations regarding the distribution business, which was regulated, and in the past, they opened up this business to the foreign investors in the past several years, and they're looking into this market to expand into the Vietnam market locally rather than the traditional approach of manufacturing and exporting those products outside of Vietnam. Here is another investment trend. You can see small scale projects of less than 100,000 US dollars. 2013, there were only 22. Last year, this jumped to 374. So this is an indication that not only the big companies are interested in the Vietnam market, but also the individual business, family business, small scale business, they're also pouring into the Vietnam market as well. So here is a summary of the previous slide that there has been a great spike of small businesses coming into Vietnam from Korea. This is due to the startup companies and family businesses targeting the Vietnam local market, in line with the Korean investors' movement into the distribution business and retail business in Vietnam. So looking ahead, so what's going to happen with all these investments in the past? What do we expect from the Korean investors in the coming years? Well, the U.S.-China this trade dispute during the past 2 years have made Korean investors in China more difficult to put up with the Chinese investment or the Chinese regulators on a long-term basis. And those companies based in China for the past 3 years have consistently thought over and moving their plants back into Vietnam. And also the saturation of investment in certain areas together with the high labor costs has given the companies incentives to look for investment opportunities and resettle their manufacturing bases into Vietnam. And also you can see more investments not coming into Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, but in the vicinities of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh and other areas such as Da Nang, Quang Nam, and far stretching out further than Binjung and Dong Nai provinces to find a lower labor cost and skilled labor forces there. So aside from newly coming into foreign investment, foreign direct investment, Korean Korean investors are looking into M&A opportunities and expansion of their existing opportunities in Vietnam. This has been true and will continue to be true as long as the Vietnam government and Vietnam stays steady with its growth, economic growth, and the investment opportunities. And also, Korean investors are looking into more M&A opportunities to overcome and go around the heavily regulated industries such as finance and energy industry. And lastly, I want to mention the current COVID challenges that we're facing. For the time being, I've been hearing a growing number of concerns surrounding the situation. They're starting to realize and face the impact of COVID-19 in their industry. They're kind of adopting wait and see approach, suspending and delaying and holding up their investment plan and expansion plan. And hopefully as the clouds, uncertain clouds of COVID-19 clears up, we'll have a better picture of how things will play out for the Korean investors and other investors. That's the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me.
We actually received quite a few questions from the audiences. I got one very interesting question from a Korean venture capital analyst as well. Maybe I'll ask that one, and either Mr. Ahn or Mr. Pham can take it. I'll read the original question as well, just to make sure nothing gets lost in translation. So
Yes.
베트남이 사회주의 중심의 시장 경제에 맞서 한국 투자자들이 반드시 알아야 할 부분들은 어떤 것이 있습니까? So as you know, Vietnam follow a different political system than Korea, right? So what are some of the considerations that Korean investors should be aware? I think like if maybe you can tie to some of the questions. Wow, there's so many questions from the audiences now. Maybe you can tie to some of the questions from the audiences, such as what are the factors that Korean investor consider when they choose to enter, they choose which provinces they want to enter to Vietnam.
Okay. Allow me to go through those questions step by step. I'll first mention the difference between and specific distinctive aspects of Vietnam in terms of investment, because it is under a socialist regime and different from Korea and the US. One factor you should consider is the land. Land in Vietnam, by its constitution, is owned by all the people of Vietnam, meaning no permanent ownership is allowed in Vietnam. So that's a distinctive issue that frustrates and confuses investors when they first enter into Vietnam. And this is particularly important because this creates problem because you're not allowed to provide your land or the land use rights as collateral to others, except for certain exceptions. So that you should be careful. There is different land system because of different regime is applicable when you're purchasing land use right in Vietnam. You have to have a different concept when approaching land system in Vietnam. And another factor I want to highlight is the difficulty of laying off and handling the labor disputes with your employees. Unlike the US, there is no free will employment system in Vietnam, and the rights and the privileges of labor workers of Vietnam employees are very strong and cannot be laid off without causes or specific reasons. Even if you have a specific reason, if they file a grievance report to the labor authorities, or oftentimes foreign investor will have a great amount of headache dealing with those issues. So be careful when you're employing someone, you're entering into a labor relationship with your employee. You need to have these things all in your mind to plan out how you would operate and manage your labor forces for your company operation. Those are the my comments to the questions related to the distinctive aspects of socialist regime in Vietnam. What was your other question, Nam?
I think just generally, what are the factors that Korean investors consider when they choose to enter Vietnam? The labor force.
Well, there are many reasons behind why Korean investors are interested in the Vietnam market. Korea by itself has limited resources. It has limited resources, and geographically is limited by the sea, three sides, and up on the north is blocked by North Korea. So Korea naturally is finding a way to expand to other countries. And why Vietnam? Number one, I would like to point out is culturally, Vietnam and Korea are very similar. We're heavily both influenced by Confucianism. We're very family-oriented societies. We share the same history of being invaded by other countries, at the same time divided into two countries. All those things make Korea and Vietnam people feel similarity to each other. And when you have numbers, financial numbers and business plans all set up, and you're also culturally very similar, I think it will make your investment decision a lot more easier and faster. Secondly, another factor is that you have skilled laborers and lower wages. So for manufacturing companies, if you see their business structure, you take margin out of the sale of your products and the production, which is largely labor cost. So labor cost is number one point when you consider setting up and establishing your manufacturing plant in any destination. And Vietnam has a very young, skilled labor population where you can utilize, and they're not only based in southern area, they're there in the middle central area and the northern area. And together with the Vietnam government's favorable policy to encourage Korean investors to come in and provide tax incentive and etc. All coupled with that, I think those are the two factors why Korean investors want to probably move into Vietnam.
Mr. Pham, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think Ujin mentioned a very interesting, bond between Korea and Vietnam, and I think those are, I shouldn't comment. I agree with that.
Thank you. So we're actually already over time, and I know that Mr. Ahn has another meeting, so he might have to leave very soon. However, in our program, we still have one more section on the changes in Vietnamese securities law, and maybe I'll hand it back to Mr. Pham to continue with the presentation. At the same time, I just want to say thank you again, Mr. Ahn, for sharing with us all of your experiences as like one of the trailblazer Korean lawyers in Vietnam. So really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure, and I hope to see you and each one of you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Catch up with you soon.
Mr. Ahn, maybe you can stop sharing, and Mr. Pham can get back to his presentation.
Okay, will do.
Okay, I think I'm just gonna wrap up very quickly the remaining part of this discussion on new securities regulation. So this new development is a draft decree of the government implementing the law. As a background, I have to mention that decrees of the government in Vietnam are very important with respect to the implementation of law, and especially in the securities market. The draft decrees of the government are very, very, much followed and reviewed by the players in the market. And this one is a very important decree, which is a very long one. So it was just introduced by the State Securities Commission a couple of weeks ago. So today I'm going to go through some of the big changes that foreign investors should look out for in terms of investment into public companies or investment into the Vietnamese securities market. The first change proposed by the draft decree is about the room for foreign ownership. So under the new rule, the public companies who are listed on the stock exchange can set their own room of foreign ownership as long as those rooms are lower than the mandatory room set by the government. For example, all the banks in Vietnam are subject to a mandatory regulatory room of 30%. Foreigners cannot own more than 30% of bank. under the new rule, banks can set an even lower percentage. Let's say they set for 20%. So they reserve 10% of the room to issue for foreign investors in the future. The government now proposed to take away that right of public companies. So they say you can no longer do that. Meaning, if the law says your room is 30%, you have to play by 30%, and foreign investors can buy up to 30%. You cannot limit the right of foreign investor to buy. Of course, public companies, many comments have been raised objecting to this change. The reason is, many companies want to reserve room for foreign investors to do other stuff. For example, they want to be able to issue convertible bonds. So in order to honor the conversion commitment, they have to reserve some room to convert when the bondholders, international bondholders, want to convert, right? So if without that, they can no longer do that, unless they also issue, double the amount of shares to domestic investors to, in general, increase the overall total sums of shares in the company. So I don't know how practical is that, and I don't know whether or not this proposal will be implemented in the final decree. But if it is, then public M&A will need to be restructured. In public deals, the structure will need to take into consideration the fact that there will be very small room, or there's no room for companies to do the transaction unless they also issues to domestic investors. The second change is about Treasury shares. So previously, for public companies, this is different from the rest of the world. Public companies, they can buy back shares and they can hold the shares as Treasury shares. For non-public companies, whenever they buy back shares, they have to cancel the shares, right? They have to cancel the bought back shares and reduce the charter capital of the company. Now, the new law says public companies, you have to do the same thing as non-public company, meaning whenever you buy back shares, you have to cancel those. You cannot keep Treasury share and it reissues those shares in the future. So one question is, what about the shares that I bought back before the effective date of the new law? What can I do with that? Because we bought it back when we are allowed to do. So, under the new law, what can we do with that? So the new decree specify very clearly that yes, when, as long as you bought back legally before the date of the new law, then you can legally hold the Treasury share, and you can resell, you can cancel, you can do whatever you want with it, as long as you are permitted under the old law, and you are not subject to the new restriction in the new law. So we have 6 months from now, 5 months from now until the date of the new law. So I don't know how public companies, if they want to have a reserve of Treasury shares, whether they're going to rush out and buy back as much shares as possible, so that they have a number of Treasury shares that they can reissue in the future. I don't know. We will wait and see, and whether or not this they will play out in practice. The other changes are not significant change, but it's just kind of clarification and adding clear mechanism for companies to do. For example, those relating to offering shares below par value, a mechanism to convert from LLC to JSC by conducting an IPO. Previously companies, when they want to do an IPO, they need to convert into the JSC first, and before they do the IPO, the public offering of shares to the market. Now there is a clear mechanism under the decree to do that. Adding a mechanism to convert shares from bond prohibition of insider announcement. Now, the next one is interesting. Companies can issue secured bonds. The new decree proposed to add a new type of collateral for you to secure your bond, which has receivables of the issuer. I don't know, maybe this is the first sign of Vietnam is starting to allow securitization, but this is very interesting change and one that should be followed up very closely by investors. The final proposed change is relating to every bond issuer. If you are issuing a large enough bond, you need to get a credit rating by a domestic credit ranking organization. The problem here is there is no Vietnamese credit rating organization or very limited number of those companies. And the SSC also acknowledged that fact, and they also acknowledge that, yeah, we want them to be, ranked, but we also understand that Vietnam do not have a lot of those, credit rating agencies. So for now, we're just going to propose and we're just going to apply those requirements for very large, big bond issuance. But maybe in when this decree will be implemented, we will see more credit rating agency being licensed by the Ministry of Finance, or we will see like S&P or other Moody's will have their own branch in Vietnam to meet this requirement. We'll see. This will be very interesting for the Vietnamese market. So this is the overview of the new development in terms of the securities regulations. Let me know if you have any question on this.
I think the last point on credit rating agency is really interesting. Maybe a lot of our VFS member would be interested in knowing more. So we can contact you after the program.
Yes.
So everybody, thanks again. We're kind of already 30 minutes over time. And if we didn't get to your questions, or if you have any specific request or question for legal advice, you are welcome to contact our speakers. I would like to thank Mr. Pham again for sharing us these legal updates and your experiences advising foreign investors in Vietnam. We hope everyone in the audiences have found this webinar informative and interesting. Please follow Vietnam Finance Society website for future events and webinars. So thank you again for taking your time. I know it's Friday night and Saturday morning, but again, we really appreciate your attendance to this program. So wish everybody an awesome weekend.
Thank you.